Good morning and welcome to a very special interview show of The Prode. Tensions between Russian Federation and the West are at an all-time high, and on the other hand, there is no hope of a ceasefire as of now on the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war. Joining us today from India to explain us the whole conflict and its geopolitical impact on the world, and to explain us the principle of indivisible security is India's former ambassador to Saudi Arabia, Oman, and UAE, and one of India's foremost minds in the field of geopolitics and diplomacy, Ambassador Talmiz Ahmad. Thank you so much, Ambassador, for your time. A very warm welcome to the
Thank
show.
you. Thank
So,
you.
sir, I would like to begin the discussion by asking that what is your overall assessment of the recent developments coming from the war to start with, and then we'll go to the historical background and other things.
You see, there is an extraordinary fog of misinformation surrounding what is happening there, so that large sections of the international community have practically no knowledge of what is happening on the ground. We are being fed a certain narrative, usually from Western sources, which indicate a certain situation which has nothing to do with reality. They have been projecting to us a defeat of the Russian armed forces, that they are floundering, that there is this plucky Ukrainian resistance, and that the West is rushing weaponry to them, and they are actually making progress. None of this is true. The factual position is, within the first week or so, the Ukrainian war machine was destroyed. And it is non-functional from that day till today. You have not seen any evidence of massed counterattack. You have not seen any infantry formation, armor formation, massive use of artillery. If any of the narratives were true, you would be seeing this. What has happened is that the command and control scenario relating to the Ukrainian military has been now ended. So you have isolated groups. You must have seen this on television, 2 or 3 soldiers going here and there, carrying out individual acts. And you see it from their perspective. So there is an embedded journalist moving around with this group of 2 or 3 people. It is not even at platoon level. I mean, these are isolated individuals. So this is the factual position. Now, within a few days of this, President Zelensky wanted to have peace immediately. You will remember that he had announced Ukraine doesn't want to enter the NATO at all. And you had the first round of negotiations in Belarus, in Minsk, around early March. And then you had the second round in Istanbul. After the second round, you must have noted quite a lot of progress was made. Each side, of course, was pushing a maximalist position, but it gave the impression that there is going to be a kind of settlement. What the contours of that settlement would be were not clear, but certainly there would be a viable ceasefire. But you will see immediately thereafter, Zelensky was put under pressure, it seems to me, from the Western side, not to accept any ceasefire, not to accept any settlement, and to continue the war of attrition. So what we are seeing, therefore, you have seen that Zelensky is no longer talking about NATO. He is not talking about. He's just talking about war and conflict. And the West is constantly announcing massive flow of weaponry going into billions and billions of dollars. This was the same West which was floundering in the face of massive economic difficulties, and suddenly they have got billions of dollars worth of equipment flowing into Ukraine. What you are left with is the impression that this is what the war was all about. Supplies of massive weaponry. Now, what are the strategic, why is the US intent on this? The US's interest is to, number one, maintain its hegemony. You have seen over the last 10, 15 years, there is talk of a new world order, that the United States is a disengaged and diminished force, that it has capacity, but that capacity today is not what it was earlier, and that there is room for other players to enter the scenario. So I think that the Americans have used this conflict to consolidate their position as the world's hegemonic power, and to do this on the basis of a united Europe under their tutelage. This was another aspect, because the Europeans were hinting at wanting to become independent role players in world affairs. And this has been ended. United States needs NATO because that is the only basis on which they can assert their global hegemony. So this is what they want to do. As far as Ukraine is concerned, they are going to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian. They will provide the weaponry and to some extent some local advice, but otherwise it's Ukraine on its own. So it's a devastated military machine is facing a very robust Russia. Russia has already attained its war aims. Its intention was to destroy Ukraine as a fighting force. That was accomplished very quickly. Its military industry has been completely devastated. Command and control has been ended. Also, there have been territorial gains precisely in those areas in which Russia has been interested, and that is the eastern side. So the eastern side is now under Russian control. The second achievement of the Russians geopolitically is in the Black Sea. In the Black Sea, you find that beyond Crimea, they have gone into Mariupol. And they are also talking about taking over Transnistria, which is in Moldova, the edge of Moldova between Moldova and Ukraine. That happens, Ukraine effectively will become a landlocked country, and Black Sea will come under Russian influence. What the Americans want is to keep the war going as long as possible, provide more and more weaponry into Ukraine, consolidate their hold over Europe, and over a period of time, through a war of attrition, debilitate Russia. There is loose talk, which you always find from the American talk of regime change, that there will be, as a result of this, there will be regime change. Putin is mad, he has lost control, he doesn't know what is happening, and there will be the rise of these generals who will replace and bring somebody in. This is the kind of delusion they have had with regard to Iran for the last 40 years. And they have imposed massive sanctions on Russia. None of those is working in the way the Americans would have wanted. And certainly the idea of regime change is completely removed. So this is my understanding of the scenario. Number one, Ukraine is over as a fighting machine. Number two, Russia has more or less completed its war games and is today consolidating itself. Number three, there is a war of attrition engineered by the Americans against the Russians, but I don't think their game plan is going anywhere. What their interest is, prolong the conflict, consolidate yourself in Europe, bring in more players onto your side, and prepare for the long haul, prepare for a long-term confrontation with the Russians.
Yeah. Now, sir, going to the historical background. So, could you please take us through the historical background of this whole conflict? Like, what made Russia so obsessed about Ukraine, and what, according to you, is the root cause of this whole conflict?
It's not a question of obsession. Countries don't get obsessed. Countries look at their national interest. As you recall, the whole story goes back to the end of the Cold War and everything that happened during that period. And I don't want to trouble you with the detailed narratives relating to that. But basically, what happened is that the Soviet Union collapsed, the Warsaw Pact collapsed, and this was the period where the Americans, uh, uh, on the one hand, spoke of a new world order that would be based on justice and rule of law and transparency and equality of nations. But the real game plan was to use this extraordinary unipolar moment to, to focus on attaining and ensuring the longevity of the hegemonic power of the United States. So NATO was not disbanded. If NATO had been disbanded at that time, you would have had the United States going back to Fortress America, and the Europeans would have become independent role players in control of their own destiny. But US can only be a global hegemonic power if it is anchored in NATO and has the subordinate support of the Europeans. And that is what happened. Not only did you find that NATO was consolidated as a security force, it was expanded. So the massive expansion of NATO occurred and it has continued. And therefore, From Russia, the signals have been very, very clear. The signals were that enough, stop. You are crossing red lines. Because not only is this membership of NATO expanding the American security space, you are planting missiles pointed at Russian targets. So when Romania joined NATO, you have actually missiles pointing all across the European part of Russia. So which country in the world would not protest about this? Recall here the Cuban Missile Crisis when the Soviet Union planted missiles in Cuba pointing at American targets. Recall here the Monroe Doctrine where the Americans say they will not allow any non-local power to enter the entire American continent from North America to the tip of Latin America. Now, this is your red line. This is your core security concern. And the warnings have been given consistently by the Russians that expansion of NATO is a red line. The most significant remark was made in 2008 by Putin, where he made it very clear that Ukraine and Georgia would not join. And there was a short, sharp conflict in Georgia as well, which ended Georgia's attempts to join NATO and also lost certain territory, Abkhazia and South Ossetia. But the Americans have not given up because they need this confrontation as an end in itself, retain their own hegemony on the one hand and also sell arms on the other. I do not believe, and this is my objective assessment, I do not believe Russia poses a strategic threat to Western Europe. But if you keep on expanding NATO, you are creating the conditions of insecurity. And this is the original call. So the the Russians had made their position clear in 2014. 2014, they again had invaded Ukraine, put certain, the war was ended through the Minsk Accords. They also took back Crimea. But the Americans did not give up. And I think that was the basis you could have at that stage settled matters. But I want you to go back. Very few people now remember that Biden was actually very accommodative of Putin. In June last year, he had the meeting with Putin in Geneva. And the public remarks that Biden made at that time indicated an understanding of Putin's red lines, particularly his concerns relating to Ukraine. Most of us thought, and after that, as you know, there's a flurry of visits of senior American officials engaging with Russia on various issues because they wanted predictability, they wanted stability, they were looking at strategic cooperation in the region, etc. Recall here the visit of Wendy Sherman on the one hand, the CIA chief on the other. The CIA chief, William Burns, actually had a meeting with Putin, which is a very rare engagement. He's a former ambassador to Moscow, former US ambassador to Moscow. But then suddenly you see something, and that is linked with US domestic politics. From November, you find firstly, as soon as Biden made his remark of accommodation, there was a howl of protest coming from various American sources, not just right-wing sources, even Washington Post. They scream that there cannot be this kind of accommodation. Countries should be free to decide what they want to do, etc. So the undermining of the Biden posture began right from November onwards and became more shrill. By the time you come to December last year, the American tune has changed. So you ask yourself, why did this happen? And the answers are very clear to me. Biden's popularity rating had reached rock bottom. It was 37%. He had failed to handle the kind of inspirational leader the Americans had hoped he would be after the nightmare of Donald Trump. Obviously, none of that was happening. He seemed to be, if I can use the nicest word possible, wishy-washy. The kind of robust leadership that you expected the American president, he was not delivering on that. He was particularly a disaster on the economic side. Because of the polarized scenario in the country, he could not push his domestic agenda. Some sections of his own party were voting against him in the Senate. And most of all, the deepest humiliation for the Americans was the fiasco relating to the withdrawal from Afghanistan. What was the nightmare scenario facing Biden at that time? That he would lose the November elections. And that would mean that 2 years into his own presidency, he would be a lame duck president for the next 2 years. My own personal view is that this entire Ukraine confrontation has been engineered by the Americans overwhelmingly for domestic interests. What are the domestic interests? Biden's personal standing and popularity as a leader. Number two, the need to boost American leadership in different parts of the world, particularly in Europe. And above all, pander to the arms industry. Because the arms industry would have been the biggest loser if you were to have accommodation, moderation, mutual understanding, what Biden and Putin had agreed to at Geneva, and which the officials had carried forward. If you are going to have any of that, the arms industry would be the biggest loser. And the one issue on which there is broad spectrum consensus in the US political scenario, it is the support for the arms industry. They may not agree on anything, but they agree that the arms industry must be supported, because the arms industry, a multi-billion-dollar industry, is the source of financial support for many of these politicians, Democrat or Republican. So I think these are the factors that completely changed the approach and led to this present day confrontation.
Yeah, so if we even saw that during the Afghanistan crisis, the approval rating of President Biden fall on a very great extent. So yeah.
Yes,
Yep.
that was already apparent, and that is what finally came home, because on the domestic side, he was not winning. The hope was that he would make up with his grand plans. You remember the grand plans for the infrastructure initiative, the pandemic initiative. Many of these floundered because of lack of support from within his own party. And if you have 50 senators, even if 2 or 3 senators from your side vote on the other side, your proposal is lost. Therefore, his domestic agenda has been an utter failure as of now. And that is why you need war. If you go back and you coolly look at many American initiatives which have led to massive conflict, there's been a major domestic element. Strategic interests of the United States and security interests were secondary. Recall here the assault, the US sanctions inspection regime in Iraq, the dual containment. This was entirely the pressure on the president from the Israel lobby. Come to the assault upon Iraq. The assault upon Iraq in 2003 entirely due to domestic pressure from the Israel lobby. Well documented now. So the domestic pressure. Recall here even a small episode in regard to Iraq, where Clinton was facing impeachment due to the Monica Lewinsky scandal. He assaulted Iraq 4 times over 4 days with massive missiles. Domestic consideration. All the time it is domestic consideration that motivate the US president and the forces around him rather than real security concerns. This is then clothed later on. After you have initiated the assault, you clothe it in big language. Democracy versus authoritarianism. Or you talk, oh, Putin is a butcher. Putin is a war criminal. This kind of absolutely rubbishy rhetoric clothes the very crass concerns of the political order.
Yeah. Then where do you see UK in this whole conflict, sir? Because they
Well,
have
I
been
don't
very
see
aggressive
UK
in criticizing Russia.
with deep respect to you and to you, the place where you are located today. I cannot waste 3 minutes of my time thinking about the UK. I don't regard UK as a serious strategic role player in world affairs. You see a prime minister who is shattered because he has no credibility at home within his own party. The main news from the UK is who is going to replace him. In this scenario, Boris Johnson runs from country to country pretending to be a statesman. Don't waste your time and my time on this. Let's get on with it. UK is not a serious role player in world affairs. It is whatever you are looking at, again motivated by domestic compulsion and should be of no interest to serious people.
Yeah. So now coming to NATO's expansion, and I think that NATO's expansion is actually one of the reasons behind this whole conflict, and it only triggered the whole invasion. And if yes, then is it correct on moral grounds to attack a country and its civilians just to uphold the principle of indivisible security? And as a diplomat yourself, how do you see this whole principle of indivisible security?
As a human being, not one of us condones war. I think war is the most wasteful enterprise that human beings have ever embarked upon. And my own view is very rarely have wars settled the issues that led to them. There is a destruction of human achievement, of human life, of human institutions. Wars leave behind a long trail of bitterness. The whole effort at reconstruction takes decades. A very simple point that I will make here is it's very, very easy to start a war and almost impossible to end it. And certainly to end it on terms which would be to your advantage. Having said this, why has war continued to be a factor in human life? There are concerns relating to security. There are security concerns. And every country in the world has a certain maximalist position and a certain minimalist position. The maximalist position, leave aside. The minimalist position is what we call today red lines. If you were sitting in Moscow, whenever I talk about security concerns, I ask my interlocutor to, for a moment, place himself or herself on the other side. What are they reading? What are they thinking about? What is their assessment? And then you get a far better idea. If you're obsessed only with yourself, then you are no use as a security analyst. If you were sitting in Moscow and you saw this, firstly, not only has NATO been retained, but NATO is confrontationist. NATO is expanding eastwards so that more and more countries are coming on board and directing missiles at Europe, at Russia. Who has Russia threatened? Russia has not threatened any country in Western Europe, and yet you find all of them with missiles directed at Russia. No attempt at dialogue which would assuage your security concerns. Russia has little concern about European Union membership. Join the European Union, they would say. They would not like it, but they would not stop you because it has no security implication. People want a better life. People want to enjoy the benefits of being part of a larger European enterprise. So be it, right? Do that. Economic factors can motivate many decisions, but NATO is a purely security alignment directed overwhelmingly at Russia and Russia's interests. Russia has red lines, and red lines are very clear. And they have been conveyed. It's not something that you overheard day before yesterday. They have been conveyed consistently. They've been conveyed very clearly on the ground in 2008. They've been conveyed militarily in 2014. And that's 8 years ago. And yet the United States, so I would say at one level, the position that the Western Alliance has taken would suggest to me that they were actually interested in a conflict, that the United States wanted to drag the Russians into the conflict that we are seeing because it causes them no cost except to sell more arms into a beleaguered country. Now, yes, of course, Ukraine is paying the price, but hasn't this happened all too often in proxy war? And it is now admitted that Ukraine is a proxy war and the Western powers are behind it, pumping equipment, pumping military equipment. If they had given this kind of development assistance, you would have had a very different scenario. Nearly $100 billion worth of equipment is being pumped into this country. And for what purpose? The war machine is already dead. It is largely for political purposes to serve interests at home and to boost the image of the president. As far as Biden is concerned, he has moved from 37% to 42% overall, taking into account the Ukraine conflict. So there has been a benefit of 5%. But I will assure you it will be there away because his approval rating on the economy is rock bottom on inflation 60% and in otherwise handling of the economy still very, very low. When people finally vote in November, it won't be on Ukraine. They are going to vote on issues that matter to them on daily basis. There is overwhelming opposition to the Americans getting involved directly in conflict. So you will see, for instance, that there will be a vote, and this is not going to help Biden at all. I personally see the country is so polarized, it is so dysfunctional, and the Democratic Party is so divided within itself that you are not going to be able to see any resurrection of the presidency. I think we are looking at a lame duck.
Yeah. So now coming to the geopolitical impact of the war on the neighbors of Russia. So do you think that nations like Finland should join NATO, seeing what happened in Ukraine? Because we have also seen that Russia has threatened Finland with nukes if they will even ever think of joining NATO. So how do you see this whole thing?
I fear, I feel that this is being done impetuously, that this is being done without the reflection that such a serious decision should be. Yeah, Finland has remained neutral for several decades and under pressure. What happens is, and I'm going to speak freely here, many countries have very powerful pro-US lobbies at home, cultivated assiduously by the Americans over a long period of time. And they are the ones that are used in such moments to put the kind of pressure. So suddenly you feel a sense of insecurity, overnight. Well, Finland didn't feel this insecurity in 2008 and 2014, but they have been impelled. But I think this is harmful. And it is harmful very clearly for the reasons that have been spelled out. That once you join NATO, you can't get out. You become part of a permanent alliance confronting Russia. Till you are non-aligned, till you are neutral, you can engage with your neighbor on a platform of mutual accommodation and mutual understanding. The moment you join NATO, that scenario is over. And I think what Finland would do, and I think Sweden, if it were to follow, is that they are getting under pressure. They are getting into situations which are not in their interest. And I think there will be a price paid over the long term because you become an antagonist. Finland and Sweden were not antagonists. You may be uneasy. If you remember, through the Cold War, Sweden had built up a very powerful military force. It was, I think, in 1991, the fourth most powerful military force in the world. And it then dismantled it and went on to build up its own economic and technological capacity. My suggestion is that every time you have a security concern, first build your domestic capacity and then strengthen your diplomatic engagement. You don't have to rush into an alliance which is only going to aggravate stresses over the long term. So I think it is harmful, and I feel that it has been done without the reflection of its implications that such a serious decision would have required.
Yeah. And so, what will be the impact of the war on India and India's relations with the West, primarily the United States?
See, India has a very long, deep, and sustained commitment to the idea of strategic autonomy. During the Cold War, we called it non-alignment, and now we call it strategic autonomy. Strategic autonomy is that I am a major player in world affairs. I have the capacity to understand my own interests and concerns, and I will not automatically join one side or the other in a certain conflictual scenario. The United States, today India has the closest possible ties with Russia. It has also close ties with the United States. And as you can see through the recent visit of our Prime Minister between 2nd and 4th May, he also has very close ties with the European Union, particularly Germany and France. India is taking a multiplicity of initiatives to safeguard its interests. It has relations with the Americans. At one time, the impression given that we had shifted to the American camp. This was largely promoted by the American lobby in the United States, in the country, in India. That has been corrected. That has been corrected. And today it's very clear that India, the kind of positions India took, number one, help to dilute the security component of the Quad and to make it a long-term cooperative platform connected with the technology, climate change, pandemic, vaccination, etc. Non-threatening. Because the last thing you want to do in the neighborhood in which India is located is to be part of a security alliance against China. So that course correction has been done. The kind of position we have taken on the Ukraine conflict, where we have made it very clear that we are not going to join any anti-Russia bandwagon, I think is also a very clear signal. For the rest, we are happy to cooperate. We had the 2+2 in Washington. We talked about defense cooperation and various other aspects of cooperation. We don't believe in the American dictum. If you're not with us, you are against us. The Americans have this very crude approach, and they're using it against India as well, threatening us. Dalip Singh tells us there will be consequences if you don't join us. Blinken talks about human rights violations. European Union sends a fellow here from their human rights group. And the Indian position is very clear. And I think our external affairs minister made it very clear that, look, if it comes to these kind of interventions in a domestic scenario, we also have enough arsenal available with us to talk about what you guys are up to. And the less said about the American scenario, the better. So nobody is going to tell us how to, we may not have the ideal domestic scenario, but at the same time, we are not going to allow someone else to pressurize us in a political context, on the basis of what is happening. I think the Indian message is very clear. So I think we have opted for strategic partnership. We have asserted its efficacy at all platforms. I think the message has been delivered. We just have to see whether the Americans are able to digest it or not. They are very, very frequently, they become hostile. They become hostile. Either you are with us or you are against us. This was their position in 1947. This was their position after 9/11 as well. And they don't understand the nuances. They have no sensitivity with regard to the interests of other countries.
So, sir, how do you see the proposed global security initiative by China for countering the claim that it is for the countering the hegemony of the West and to unite the East? So, how do you see this whole concept?
You see, the IR theory tells us, and our experience of security issues informs us, that there are two approaches to security that nations have adopted. One is what is called collective security. Collective security arrangements bring a set of like-minded countries together in an alignment and set up a confrontation with another set of country or another set of countries. So NATO is part of such a collective security alignment, okay? Alliance. You have another concept which is promoted robustly in IR theory, though it is not always visible in reality. And that is the idea of indivisible security. Indivisible security is that we are secure if all are secure. If one of us is insecure, all of us are insecure. The idea is that instead of having collective security arrangements that confront, that are exclusive and confrontationist, you must have arrangements that bring all the people together in one common platform, so that they don't threaten everybody, feel secure within that larger structure. I would say to you that the arrangements put in Europe, placed in Europe after the Treaty of Westphalia, became successful and ensured the security of Europe for nearly a century because it was an inclusive arrangement where everyone participated, the norms and rules were accepted, and people felt that, yes, this is something that we can be part of. Something similar possibly was attempted in the terms of the Concert of Europe in the 19th century, where countries became participants in this. Where that broke down, it was called the Concert of Europe, but that broke down is due to separate alliances. So the alliance system broke the back of the Concert of Europe and prepared the ground for conflict which finally led to the First World War and which led to the Second World War and finally led to the Cold War, which was again confrontationist. What Xi Jinping has done is, in the context of confrontation that is ongoing, centered around the expansion of NATO, is to propose an idea, which I would call it is an integral part of indivisible security, where he has talked about countries coming together. He has referred obliquely to the alliance system and the idea of confrontation, and to replace, the words used are replace alliance, confrontation, and zero-sum approach with an approach that brings idea of confrontation enshrined in NATO and more immediately in our own neighborhood is possibly contained in the concepts of Quad and UK and AUKUS, which are confrontation. Bring countries together, make them part of a security alliance, and confront your neighbor. Instead of having an inclusive arrangement in which China could also participate and all of us would have same norms, same rules. Now, this is what we are looking at today. What we are looking at is an alternative approach. Now, you know that the timing of this is, on the one hand, you have China's concerns relating to Quad and AUKUS, and on the other hand, you have the ongoing tensions relating to NATO expansion and the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. So the reaction to this idea in the West has been very hostile because it challenges the existing confrontationist approach enshrined and best manifested by NATO and the right of expansion of NATO to threaten Russia. So there has been a kind of spontaneous rejection of this. And in India too, because of the ongoing problem which we have at Ladakh, but more importantly from the American lobby which we have within the Indian media, there has been a mindless reaction within one day. I have read 3-4 articles and I find, but this author doesn't even know what they are talking about. I agree, they have called one article I read is kind of hysterical language, suggesting, oh, Chinese are hypocrites. How dare they say this? They themselves have been violating this. Excuse me, which country in the world is not a hypocrite? Have not most countries led from the front by the US talked about democracy and freedom, even as they have destroyed entire nations and killed hundreds of thousands of people? That is a kind of mindless, intemperate reaction. Anytime a proposal comes, study it, see how to flesh it out. You see, very often what leaders do is that they propose an idea, see how it flies. And you will find, for example, what Xi Jinping has suggested and which has been elaborated by his deputy minister, it will bite in ASEAN. ASEAN is going to be interested in something. ASEAN is terrified of Quad and AUKUS. Luckily, Quad's security role has been diluted to a certain extent. Some of the rhetoric has not, particularly in the US, but AUKUS, a very robust, overtly security alliance. So I think that we should, my own view is as follows. We must look at the idea, analyze it, see what we would like in it. Okay, leave aside the fact that it has come from China is another matter. Does this region of which India is a part, the so-called Indo-Pacific, does Indo-Pacific need a confrontationist, security-based approach, or does it need an indivisible security approach where all parties participate on the basis of shared norms and rules? I support the second. I have earlier written about this, where I have said that the Indian Ocean Rim Association is one such platform where we should relook at it. It's been around now from 1997, so it has done more than 25 years. We should look at it, see how it can serve present day purposes relating to maritime security, expand the membership, make it much more rule based. What is the best way to address security issues? Bring people in, make it inclusive so that countries then become adherent or to the same norms and rules, satisfied in the prospect that their interests will be understood by the other side. The moment you have a confrontationist approach, you are going to find countries that will resent what you have to say, will not be accommodative or moderate, and will also build up their own arsenal to see how they can safeguard their own interests. China would be doing this. If you continue to robustly confront China in the Western Pacific, you will find China will respond, A, with an aggressive approach, and B, by building up its own alliances. And China's capacity to build up alliances is pretty strong in the Indo Pacific area. Let us not forget that. ASEAN is a divided house today. And most countries don't want to get involved with conflict. Also, and I'm going to say something even more controversial now, many countries don't see the United States as a credible security provider. Have you seen the scenario in West Asia? Except for Kuwait, not a single West Asian country has supported the United States on the Ukraine issue. Not one country has initiated sanctions on Russia. Why is that? We have to ask ourselves. They value the relationship with the US, but they equally value their relations with Russia and China. They don't want to be caught in a binary. They are afraid that if you were to have a conflict, the American may not be there on your side. It's far better to have an indivisible security approach. And I feel that whatever misgivings we may have about its origin coming from Beijing, we must examine it objectively, flesh it out, see what we can add to the idea, put in some of the requirements that India would have, and then take it forward rather than this mindless rejection without telling me what else you would like in its place. So this is my response to your question.
Yeah. So, do you think that India should trust Beijing in this whole thing, and
India
should
should.
India should trust Beijing in this whole thing and should
See, the
join the
question
proposed?
is, Ronald Reagan said, trust but verify. See, the question is, don't when we use words like trust, they are value loaded. What we should do is that there must be arrangements in place that safeguard our interests. What are the arrangements in place that safeguard your interests? First, build up your own capacity. At the end of the day, you are the best guarantor of your own security. You are specific about India. I'm not talking about very small countries which are insecure, but large countries like India, build up your own capacity. The capacity is firstly to be founded on very robust national unity, very significant economic progress, building up of security institutions at home, and then also building up the capacity to which would safeguard your interest in your strategic space. As I understand it, India's strategic space is Eurasia and the Indian Ocean, from Malacca to the east coast of Africa. And then build up, I'm going to use the word carefully, alignments in the region so that like-minded countries support your alignments. I'm not talking about alliances, alignments. Alignment means conversation, dialogue. We are members of Indian Ocean Rim Association, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, BRICS. We must value these multilateral bodies. These multilateral bodies are likely to be the platform where China will be accommodated, but at the same time, it will be part of a larger discipline. It is like, what happened with the European Union, that the visceral conflict and distrust between France and Germany was diluted over time by their shared membership in a larger entity. I believe that is the way to go forward. So it's not an issue of trust. It is a question of ensuring your interests over the long term. And I believe this is possible. And the more you talk to each other, the more you understand each other, better there will be. The basis for trust will be expanded. I want to clarify to you something which has bothered many Indian very many Indian observers, and that is the Ladakh standoff. The discussion relating to the Ladakh standoff is overwhelmingly dominated in India by those who support the Western perspective, the American perspective. I want to say to you something quite different. I want to remind you what was the reason for the Chinese to start becoming uncomfortable with India? And the reason was the perception in Beijing that India was robustly, enthusiastically, and irreversibly passing into the American embrace. What was the evidence? The 4 interoperability agreements, intelligence sharing, and massive exercises. And final, what they call the straw on the camel's back, the elevation of the Quad, an aggressively anti-China coalition, the elevation of the Quad from joint secretary level to minister level. But before that, minister level. And India's participation in conversations that were robustly and overtly anti-China. I understand, and there is writing on this subject, that in China, you had a divided opinion, that the people who represented the diplomatic side and the academic side believed India would never sacrifice its strategic autonomy. People from the defense and security side argued that India has given up on strategic security. It would appear to me that what happened at Ladakh it would indicate that the debate within Beijing was won by the security and defense side. And they moved the troops to gently remind India that its core security interests lie at a peaceful border rather than in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. I agree with that position. I believe that the United States may have certain concerns relating to China's assertions in South China Sea and East China Sea, the whole Western Pacific if necessary. But it is a challenge that United States is fully capable of confronting. It is not a challenge that should concern India. Many things happen in the world, but India doesn't need to be there. I believe that South China Sea and East China, the Indian Navy should not have crossed Malacca and gone into South China Sea. For us, as far as I am concerned, the Indian Ocean begins from the Malacca Strait, goes to the east coast of Africa, and the crucial space for India is the Western Indian Ocean, with which Quad is not involved. And I believe that course correction has already occurred, and that Quad, which was an aggressive security platform, is today looking at longer term issues like climate change, technology cooperation, pandemic cooperation. I agree with that. Scholarships for young people to get benefits from educational facilities. I don't believe India's interest is served by becoming part of a security alliance that is largely focused on maritime issues in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. Therefore, I also feel, and this is where I'm going to take the discussion forward, that I think this course correction has been well understood in Beijing. I believe, recall here the dialogue we have had, certain disengagements have already occurred. The border is not as tense as it was before. No further expansions have taken place. The visit to India of President Putin in December gave the very clear message that we should become more enthusiastic participants in the RIC, the Russia, India, China, and go back to, and I would add to this, become more enthusiastic role players in BRICS and Shanghai Cooperation Organization instead of those Quad and whatever. So this is where we need. I think that message has been accepted. In March, Wang Yi visited India, and I think that certain understandings have been reached behind the scenes. The public posture was very correct and very clear, and I support it. That yes, we need to have disengagement at Ladakh. I think that will be done separately. But the clearer message was that we need to now re-engage with each other. We need to re-engage. When you have a border of 4,000, nearly 4,000 kilometers that is undemarcated, it is not a choice, it's a requirement. So I believe that is going to happen. In what shape or form it takes, we will see. The Americans are totally opposed to that. The Americans would like us to believe, to have permanent tension so that we become more and more dependent on their security umbrella. I ask a simple question. How did Quad help us? Now we have had 2 months, 2 years of confrontation in Ladakh. How did Quad help us? We just provoked the Chinese. The Quad helps the Americans. It doesn't help the Indians. I'm very clear. A few days ago, the American intelligence told their Senate or the House that the problem that India faces with China will continue. I don't think so. Why should it? We are going to engage. I think a very good point has been made by the MIT scholar Flavrel. Flavrel has pointed out that there is now need for a new basis of relations and matters relating to the border. He made a very interesting point. He said many of the agreements that we have with each other were entered into several years ago. The situation on the ground has changed. There is so much infrastructure development on both sides of the line of actual control that the old agreements no longer are operable. Our troops are far too close to each other and massively can be deployed massively at a very short time. Several thousand troops can move, when earlier a few hundred, and there was very sketchy patrolling. This is a new scenario. And I agree with that scholar that this calls for a new discussion, a new paradigm. I believe that will happen. So I'm very comfortable. I believe we have the domestic capacity. I believe that we have the clarity of vision. I believe that we have the self-confidence. And I believe above all that being with Russia and having a dialogue platform that includes Russia, China, and India, and then being part of Shanghai Cooperation Organization and BRICS, I think these are the platforms which are crucial for India's long-term interests.
Yeah. Now coming to the Russia-Ukraine war, so where do you see this war going in? Like, how do you see this war going, and what is the future of this whole conflict, and where do you think the conflict is going to end, and on what note?
Yes. First, let us look at the scenario. How is the conflict going to end, if it is likely to end? How is the issue going to be resolved? The most likely, the prospect of a victory, a military victory of either one side or the other, I don't believe is likely. If the Russians had wanted victory of the kind the Americans announced in Iraq and Afghanistan, massive carpet bombing, several thousand casualties on day one. That kind of conflict has not occurred, is not likely to occur. The Russians have not done that. There was a short, very sharp assault on the military targets. And I think that that was successful. So you could have, number one, an armistice. A armistice is a kind of a decision not to fight anymore, but to leave the situation on the ground as is, and then leave over a period of time for diplomatic and political engagements to address some of the issues. Each side may agree to leave matters as they are. The unsatisfied, like you could have, like we had with the Pakistanis in 1947-48, that you have a cessation of you have a ceasefire line, it is, and you don't, and you leave it to future interactions to address. You could also have a scenario of stalemate, which is what the Americans want. I think what the Ukrainians would want is to have a ceasefire so that they can start the process of resettling those displaced and doing some reconstruction, and then separately engaging with the Russians on the one hand and their allies on the other to see how we can improve the situation on the ground. What the Americans would like is to have a war of attrition, is to continuously maintain pressure on the Russians who are present in various places to keep, as you can see, where the Russians are located, the messages coming from Ukraine are, oh, we are attacking them, we are putting pressure on them, they will retreat at some point, etc. You see, what they would be, if you were the president in Kiev, you would be concerned that the map will change. That is why he has put his maximalist demand, and indeed the only demand, that I want the vacation of all Ukrainian territory, including Crimea. Now, you know this is not going to happen.
Yeah.
As far as I can see, either you will have a war of attrition or an armistice, which will leave the Russians controlling large part of eastern Ukraine, not only retaining Crimea, but expanding control over Mariupol, and then blockading the Black Sea, particularly Odessa, so that Ukraine becomes effectively a landlocked country. This is very likely to be the situation. Over a period of time, this would lead possibly to the partition of Ukraine. May not be accepted by the international community. After all, very few countries have accepted the Crimea being under Russia, but that has 8 years, it is still under Russian control. Many countries, you don't accept something, but you don't do much about it. For example, Israel has occupied the West Bank and the Golan Heights now from 1967. Hardly any country in the world, except the lunatic presidency of Donald Trump, no country in the world has accepted that. Most countries India has not accepted the Pakistan occupied Kashmir, though the Pakistanis suggest that it is an integral part of their country. We don't accept it, and no country in the world, because they recognize that there is a line of control. So I think what happens is there is an effective partition on the ground, and it is left to future generations to, at some stage, resolve it. The other aspect is that the American option in favor of confrontation could very likely leave the region in a state of military confrontation. You see NATO being strengthened, modern weaponry coming in, membership expanded to Finland and to Sweden. All of this would heighten the situation of military confrontation. That means rather than stepping back from confrontation into a more peaceful scenario, you are likely, on the contrary, to aggravate this idea of confrontation. This is what the Americans would want, and that is their game plan. Number one, very immediately, it ensures massive movement of American weaponry. But I would also like to remind you here that under the shadow, the fog of war, Germany has announced massive rearmament. And it has had no ripples in Europe. At any other time, rearmament of Germany would have had not just ripples, it would have had tremors in West Asia, all across Europe. It has not. Imagine a scenario where Germany, over a 5-year or 10-year period, robustly rearms and becomes a military force in Central Europe. Do you think that this is a Germany that is likely to be subordinate to American tutelage? It is going to be an independent role player, possibly a lead role player in European affairs, as was the case earlier when Germany rearmed after Versailles. So I'm going to just ring an alarm bell here. You also have a Macron proposal. Macron proposal is just like the proposal that came from President Xi Jinping. Macron's proposal talks about a scenario in Europe that is a part of European political community. He's talked about a two-tier. There is the European Union, and there could be a European community where more and more countries could join Europe, not as European Union members, but as affiliates. And this would be open to United Kingdom on the one hand and Ukraine on the other. This is an idea which the president just threw before us a few days ago.
Yeah.
It has not been fleshed out. It doesn't, but I feel that any idea that comes from a president should be studied, should be examined in terms of implication. In terms of the first reaction from Germany has been lukewarm, very rightly, because they need to study the proposal and its implications. Many countries whose membership of European Union is pending are uneasy. They had wanted full membership, but the full membership could go into decades because they are not ready for full membership. The kind of imposed membership that the Americans imposed on the European Union after the Cold War, they don't want to repeat that. When they went from 12 members to 25, because they are now saddled with a number of members who don't fit the normal criteria for membership. Therefore, what are you then looking at? This is a two-tier membership offered to Ukraine. Macron said in his speech, the likelihood of Ukraine getting full membership could take years, even decades. He said very clearly. And as you know, membership has to be done consensually. So even if one member opposes it. Also, you have seen in the context of Ukraine, the European Union is a very, very divided house. You have Hungary and Slovakia taking positions which are overtly pro-Russia and are not likely to support a broad consensus. So you are going to see Europe also in disarray. There is a lot of uncertainty. The third area of uncertainty, I would say. So first, there's an uncertainty relating to how the conflict would end. Second uncertainty is with regard to the prospects for Europe. But there is a third uncertainty, and that third uncertainty is with regard to the global order. Where are we likely to go? Many countries are uneasy with the idea of a revived new Cold War, a new binary. Most countries, most entities like West Asia on the one hand and ASEAN on the other, and South Asian countries in between, they don't want to be part of a binary. They want to be part of a more complex multipolar order. And I think this is where you will find China making very low-key forays, building into disinterest of the global community rather than the confrontationist approach being advocated by the Americans. What the Americans would like to see is to completely debilitate Russia and then turn their guns on China. I think the international community is not comfortable with this approach. And I would think that what we could finally see is a more robust Sino-Russian initiative to build partnership on the basis of economic cooperation, bring people what the Chinese call win-win. The Belt and Road Initiative is a very solid platform for this. It has already gone beyond physical connectivity to technological and health connectivity. And you may find that many countries would find that much more interesting to them. As you know, large numbers of countries of West Asia have signed up. Large numbers of countries of Europe are on board. So the American agenda of confrontation, which overwhelmingly is founded on the political prospects of Biden on the one hand and sale of American arms on the other, may actually be challenged by the alternative idea of a larger global community linked across the space, across Eurasia and the waters of the Indian Ocean, linked with logistical connectivity, technological cooperation, trade, investment, joint ventures. And I think that is the way. Let us also be very clear. This business of confrontation is happening at a very wrong time. We have barely recovered from the pandemic. We have not yet fully come to terms with a post-pandemic scenario. Indeed, the pandemic is already threatening the fourth wave. Economies are devastated. Employment is still at a very low premium. People don't know how to cope with the future. The discourse is run from the West, but the problems are here in our country. And the last thing any of us needs is more confrontation, more defense spending, more destruction. I think what we would find is a more benign, cooperative approach. If we are looking at the world order, it is a world order in which we would be more cautious. That means a more indivisible security paradigm rather than a confrontationist approach being advocated from Washington, D.C.
Thank you so much, sir, for your time. It was a pleasure hosting you, and thank you so much for sharing your kind thoughts with us.
All right. Thank you very much.